Please open your Bibles to the book of Daniel, the 27th book of the Old Testament. Now, if you grew up in church, and especially if you grew up going to Sunday school, then you are probably already familiar with some of the stories that we find in Daniel. Stories like the fiery furnace, when three young Jewish men were cast into a fiery furnace because they refused to bow down and worship before the king's golden image of himself. Or the story of the lion's den, when Daniel was thrown into a den of lions because he continued to call on the Lord in prayer, even though the king had made it illegal for anyone to call on any god or man in prayer except himself. In both of these stories, God showed up in power to deliver his people, and in doing so, he honored their faithfulness to him before all, and used their lives as witnesses to his power in the midst of a pagan culture, showing that no matter how things look in the world, and no matter who is in power, that it is God who is the one who's actually in control. In fact, that is what the book of Daniel really is about. It's not simply a book that gives us inspirational stories like this that make for very good Sunday school lessons. Neither is it simply a book about prophecy, but it's a book that unfolds for us the plan of God throughout the ages in such a way that reveals how the kingdoms of this world will all be overthrown and they will all pass away through the eternal kingdom that God will establish through his Son. Now, the book of Daniel begins by explaining how it is that Daniel and his three friends ended up living in the heart of a pagan empire. We read in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans." Now, at this time in biblical history, God's chosen nation of Israel had been living in unfaithfulness and rebellion against God for generations. And in an act of judgment, long foretold, God was judging his people. He had already judged the northern kingdom of Israel and its 10 tribes through the Assyrians who swept in and conquered them, displacing the survivors. That had happened many years before. And now, much later, there are only 2 tribes remaining in the southern kingdom of Judah, and the Babylonians, who have overthrown the Assyrians, have become the next great superpower in the world, and they're going to completely conquer the southern kingdom of Judah, and they're going to destroy Jerusalem, even the temple Solomon built. But several years before that catastrophic event would happen, the Babylonians carried out a couple of different raids against Jerusalem, and during one of those earlier raids, God gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Nebuchadnezzar then brought vessels from the temple back to Babylon, along with some of the best and brightest youth from among the nobility and the royal families of Judah, in order to retrain them to serve in the royal courts of Babylon, a strategy that they used in order to weaken those who were underneath them, as well as to secure their own power. This means that Daniel and his 3 friends, they were either Jewish royalty or nobility. They were special. And they were taken away from everything that they knew, everything that was familiar to them. And then they were brought into a foreign land where they were given new pagan names and retrained in a pagan culture and made to serve in a pagan court. This presented them, of course, with many serious tests of their faith, which is where we get some of the most memorable stories of the book. The first test takes place in chapter 1, and it's a test that involved food. During their 3 years of training, they were to be provided with the king's own food and wine. And while these luxuries were meant to be an advantage to them and leave them better off, they would have likely involved a violation of the Old Testament dietary laws when it came to clean and unclean foods. And so in chapter 1, verse 8, we read how Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food and with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked of the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. Now the chief was very concerned that Daniel and his friends would end up becoming visibly worse off than their companions, and that this would then reflect back on this chief eunuch and put his own life in danger before the king. So Daniel tactfully asked to be tested for 10 days, being given only vegetables and water. The chief agreed. And according to verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. Now, some people might read this and attribute the results to their diet. It's even been called the Daniel diet. But this was a demonstration of the power of God, not the power of a diet. Daniel and his friends didn't lose weight by eating vegetables. They gained weight, more weight than the others around them, which isn't exactly the result that most people are going for when they diet. Daniel and his friends were being faithful to God. They were refusing to compromise and to defile themselves. And God supernaturally rewarded their faithfulness, not only causing them to be better in appearance and fatter in flesh, but also 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters throughout the kingdom when they were brought before the king. Next, as we turn to chapter 2, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, has a dream that greatly troubles him. And so he gathers all the wise men and the enchanters and the magicians, and he asks them to tell him what his dream was and to interpret it for him. But they asked him to at least tell them the dream so they could interpret it. But he refused to tell them. He was so wanting to be sure of its meaning that he wouldn't even tell them what it was. And so they protested, saying to him in chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, "There's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." The king became furious at this, and he commanded to have all the wise men of Babylon destroyed. This included Daniel and his 3 friends. And as they were being rounded up, Daniel asked what was so urgent about all this. And then he went to the king and asked for a time in order that he might show the king the interpretation. And then Daniel went to his 3 friends and he asked them to seek mercy from God, that God might reveal the mystery. And God answered. Daniel went before the king and he proceeded to describe the king's own dream to him. In his dream, the king saw a frightening image with a head of fine gold, a chest and arms of silver, middle and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of iron mixed with clay. Then the king saw a stone that was not cut by human hands, and it struck the image on its feet, causing the image to break apart and to even disintegrate, being blown away like chaff in the wind, such that not a trace of it could be found. Then the stone that broke the image became a mountain that filled the earth. That was the dream. And Daniel then went on to explain the meaning of the dream, how each section of the image represented a different kingdom and world power. It started with the head of gold, which was King Nebuchadnezzar himself, the man who had the dream in the kingdom of Babylon. And then it went from one successive kingdom to another, until in verse 44, Daniel declared that in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all the kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. That was the stone that became the mountain that filled the earth. This stone is a theme that is picked up by other biblical writers who then apply it to Christ. The Apostle Paul, for example, he cites the prophet Isaiah in Romans chapter 9, verse 33, saying, "Behold, I am laying in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." And the Apostle Peter in Acts chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, he declared that this Jesus is the stone that was rejected by you builders, which has become the cornerstone. And that's a reference to the Psalms. And he says, "And there is salvation in no one else, for there's no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved." So this stone, it refers to Christ and to his kingdom, which was inaugurated in the days of the ancient Roman Empire. And it's been spreading throughout the world and growing as history moves towards a day when Christ returns and that kingdom is then consummated. All the kingdoms of this world will pass away without a trace. And there is only one kingdom that will last forever, and that is the kingdom of Christ. When Nebuchadnezzar heard this, he fell on his face before Daniel. And then he praised the Lord, saying in verse 47, "Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you've been able to reveal this mystery." Now, in this picture, we see the great Babylonian king of kings, the most powerful man on earth, bowing before a Jewish exile and proclaiming that the Lord is God of gods and Lord of kings. It's a beautiful picture. Now you would think that Nebuchadnezzar would now all of a sudden be a humble believer in the Lord in light of this revelation. But in the very next chapter, he lets this dream go to his head, quite literally, because he then makes a giant golden statue of himself. It stands 90 feet tall, and then he commands that everyone must worship before it, bowing down and worshiping this golden statue of him, threatening to throw anyone who doesn't do so into a fiery furnace. This leads, of course, to the second major test of faith in the book, because it's at this point when complaints are raised against Daniel's three friends, saying that they refuse to bow down to the golden image. So the king brings them in before him, and he tells them, "If you don't worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." And then he asks this question, "And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Now consider what Nebuchadnezzar is doing. He's exalting himself in the place of God. He's demanding worship by everyone. And remember, he's a king over other kings, over other nations. He's demanding the worship of the nations. And he threatens those who don't with damnation by fire. He even issues a divine challenge, saying, "Who's the God who can deliver you from my hands?" As though there were none greater than him. So it's like he forgot the lesson entirely from his dream. But they answered the king in verses 17 and 18, saying this, "If this be so, our God whom we serve, he's able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he doesn't, be it known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Just incredible faithfulness and courage here. So in a furious rage, the king commands that the furnace be heated up 7 times hotter than usual, and then to have these men thrown into it. And the furnace was so hot that those who were tasked with throwing them in, they died in carrying out their duty of casting them in. But in verses 24 and 25, King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" And they answered and said to the king, "True, okay." He answered them and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the 4th, the appearance of the 4th was like a son of the gods." So the king calls out to them from the furnace, and he calls them out. And when they come out, he sees that the fire didn't have any power over them. It didn't burn their hair. It didn't damage their clothes. They didn't even smell like smoke. And now the king, who only had just issued the challenge, "Who's the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" now has to answer his own question. And he makes a decree in verse 29 that any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who's able to rescue in this way. Once again, the most powerful king on earth is forced to acknowledge who the real sovereign one is, who the real Lord is, the one who is above all earthly powers. But sadly, he would once again forget the lesson, because in chapter 4, he's given another dream. This time it's of a great tree, whose top reached to heaven, whose fruit was abundant, and under whose branches the beasts of the field found shade. Then a holy one came and commanded that the tree be chopped down and its branches lopped off, leaving only a stump, and for its mind to be changed from a man's mind to a beast's for 7 periods of time. And in chapter 4, verse 17, we discover the reason. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. Once again, the king is disturbed, and he calls for his wise men and enchanters to come and interpret his dream, and of course they can't, just like last time. So Daniel's brought in again, and he interprets the king's dream, telling him that the tree is him. And in verse 25 he declares, "You shall be driven from among men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox. And you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you till you know the Most High rules over the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will." Daniel urged the king to repent, to break off his sins and to practice righteousness in order that his prosperity might be prolonged and avoid this fulfillment. But 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of his palace, he looks out and he says, "Is this not great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" And then a voice came from heaven that the kingdom had departed from him. And immediately the word was fulfilled as he was driven from among men, and he ate grass like an ox. We're told that his hair grew like eagle's feathers, and his nails became like bird's claws. So he's starting to look like a beast. His mind is like a beast. He lives like a beast. He's turned into a beast. Now, this is an important thing for us to consider, because when God made humanity in the beginning, he made us in his own image. He made us in his likeness. We were made in the image and likeness of God. That is what it truly means to be human. Now, whatever we decide for ourselves, God's image reflected in our lives. But whenever we rebel against God's ways, whenever we choose to instead exalt ourselves in his place, we become like beasts. We become like animals. And this theme is going to show up again and again throughout the rest of the book as several beasts representing world rulers who are hostile to God and his people appear in dreams and visions to Daniel, highlighting how far they've fallen from the glory for which we were made in the beginning. Our life is never found in living to please and exalt ourselves in God's place, as much as people may try. Our life is only found in living to know and to please and to exalt the sovereign Lord of the universe who made us and for whom we are made. And so it really shouldn't come as a surprise that in verses 34 and 35, at the end of the days, Nebuchadnezzar lifted up his eyes to heaven, and his reason returned to him, and he blessed the Most High. And he praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion. And his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. And he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" You see, God is able to humble the proud, even when they're among the most powerful of rulers on earth, revealing that he alone is God and they're not. And it's a beautiful, beautiful story of who the real sovereign is, and of a man's eyes being open to that truth and being humbled by it. But in contrast with this story, as we turn to the next chapter, we see how God is also able to bring down the proud who refuse to humble themselves before him, no matter how powerful they think they are in the world. You see, in the next chapter, we read about a different king. It's not Nebuchadnezzar anymore, it's Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son. He's throwing a party, and they're drinking. And so he calls for those holy vessels, remember, that Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple of the Lord? He calls them for them to be brought in so that they could drink from them, profaning these holy vessels, while they praise the gods of gold and silver, of bronze and iron and stone, in an act of defiance against the Lord. And as they did so, all of a sudden the likeness of a hand appeared, and it started writing on the wall, freezing the king with terror. Daniel was brought in, and he tells this new king a story about his father, Nebuchadnezzar. How he became proud because of the power God had given to him as he chose. And how God then humbled him with a season of insanity, such that he became like a beast, until he came to his senses and realized that it's the Lord who rules over the kingdoms of men, and it's the Lord who sets over them whoever he wills, that it's the Lord who is sovereign and in control. Daniel then tells Belshazzar in verses 22 and 23, "You, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this." He was aware. It's not like this was news to him. He already knew about all that and then presumed to do what he did. So in verse 23, "You've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And then you praise the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which don't see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you've not honored." Then Daniel interpreted the writing on the wall for the king, which meant his days were numbered. He was weighed in the balance and found wanting, and his kingdom was divided between the Medes and the Persians. And that very night, King Belshazzar was killed, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. This brings us to chapter 6, to another chapter and another test of faith by yet another king. Are you seeing a theme or a trend? Different kings being shown who's really in control, who's really sovereign over all things. Daniel was highly exalted and distinguished in the new kingdom, which made others very jealous of him. They tried to find fault with him in order to accuse him before the king, but they couldn't. And they knew that they wouldn't be able to find any fault with Daniel unless they found fault with him over his religion. So they went before the king and they asked him to make a decree that anyone who prays to any other god or man for 30 days, just 30 days, O king, except to you, O king, may they make it so that they'll be cast into a lion's den. They had one person in mind as they suggested this decree. Daniel knew of the decree, and yet he still continued to pray faithfully to the Lord as he always had. Then those who had set this trap for him reported Daniel to the king and demanded that he be thrown to the lions. The king reluctantly did so. And as he did so, he declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, may he deliver you. He seals him into the lion's den with a stone while pleading for God to deliver him. The king couldn't sleep that night at all. And in the morning he rushed in to check on Daniel, and according to chapter 6, verses 20 to 22, as he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. The Lord delivered Daniel. And when he was brought out of the lion's den, the king then commanded that those who accused him be thrown into the lion's den, along with their families. And now the lions' mouths are not shut, because before they hit the bottom, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. The story once again ends with a king praising the Lord as the living God who endures forever, and recognizing that his kingdom alone will never be destroyed. And so we keep seeing the same thing happening again and again, don't we? God delivering his faithful ones, living in the heart of a pagan empire, rulers of other rulers, beasts like kings and kingdoms, and showing that he alone is the sovereign one who's actually in control. That's important, because this chapter brings the narrative section of the book to a close. The first 6 chapters, they've been stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon. But from here on out, it's not. It changes to apocalyptic revelations. Our attention is focused on Daniel now, who receives his own dreams as God gives him revelations of the future and of the end times. Now, these are heavy chapters, and they've been the subject of so much discussion in the church and debate. And so our purpose for today, it's not to settle all debates about the end times, far from it. It's to see how this section, the rest of Daniel, fits into the message of Daniel as a whole, so we can see the heart of the message of the book. You see, starting in chapter 7, Daniel sees a vision of a series of beasts. 4 beasts come up out of the sea. One is like a lion with eagle's wings. Another's like a bear with ribs in its mouth. Another's like a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And then the 4th was a terrifying beast with iron teeth and 10 horns, which was followed by another little horn. Now, all of these have meanings and significance. But then in the next chapter, Daniel also is given more visions. He sees a vision of a ram with 2 horns. And this is followed by a goat with a conspicuous horn between its eyes. And these represent kings, the kings of the Medo-Persians and of the Greeks. And all of these have special significance and meaning. But based on what we've already learned in the previous chapters up to this point, the succession of kingdoms in this world, like we saw in the statue in chapter 2, and about how when humanity, when it turns away from God and from his will, becomes like beasts, like we saw in the case of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. Then it really shouldn't surprise us now to learn that these beasts represent hostile kingdoms in the world that oppose God and oppose his people. These beasts are kingdoms. This is important for us to realize because of what happens immediately after those first 4 beasts come out of the sea in chapter 7. In verses 9 to 14, listen to what we read. As Daniel looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. This is God. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were open. The Lord seated on his throne in judgment. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, remember there was a fourth beast with the little horn? And as I looked, the beast was killed, and his body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, and their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Then he says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So God sits on his throne in judgment, kills the beast, takes dominion from the other beasts. And then God gives dominion and a kingdom to a Son of Man. This is a vision of the sovereign Lord of the universe on his throne, judging the kingdoms of this world. And of the Son of Man receiving dominion and glory and a kingdom that will never pass away from the Ancient of Days, in order that all peoples would serve him. This vision is telling us something similar to the dream in chapter 2, when a stone that wasn't cut by human hands falls and destroys the image representing the kingdoms of the world, so that not a trace of them could be found. And then it became a great mountain that filled the earth. It's the same message being communicated. These dreams show us the pattern of history and the redemptive plan of God through the kingdom of his Son, which was inaugurated at the first coming of Christ, and has been spreading and growing throughout the world ever since, and is going to continue to do so until Christ returns to judge sin, to destroy evil, and to gather his people to himself. The last chapter of the book even ends with the resurrection at the end of time in verses 2 and 3, where we read, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like stars forever and ever. And then Daniel is told to shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. So there's a lot of debate among believers about the exact time and fulfillment of these apocalyptic revelations, which are fascinating, worthy of attention, worthy of study. Their message in the book as a whole is really quite clear, that the kingdoms of this world are not friendly to God or to his people. That's why they're likened to beasts. They're depicted as terrifying beasts. They resist God's will and oppress his followers. They pressure them to bow down to idolatry and to pursue self-exaltation in the place of God. But Daniel also declares to all generations that no matter what things look like here on earth, or who's in power, who's ruling today, that God is actually the one who's in control, and he's carrying out his will. The book declares so powerfully that the kingdoms of this world are all passing away. They're going to be forgotten. Not a trace of them will be remembered. They're going to be shattered by the rock of Christ's eternal kingdom and of his dominion. And then the book ends with a sobering reminder that those who persist in their rebellion against God are going to be raised to everlasting shame and contempt, while those who were faithful to him will be raised to everlasting life, where they will shine like stars. Which means that the book of Daniel, once again, it's a book about Christ. It's a book about his kingdom. It's a book about God's plan for history. And it serves as a timeless encouragement for the people of God to remain faithful to him in the midst of an ungodly world, to seek to be a witness in the midst of a pagan culture, while waiting with sure hope for the consummation of that kingdom that will last forever, knowing that this will result in eternal life and peace for all who follow him. Let's pray.